Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to yet another extremely topical and extremely timely AMET webinar. What we are about to discuss today is a very sensitive topic. According to many recent surveys, including one very recent one by the American Jewish Committee, fully 90% of American Jews believe that anti-Semitism is a rapidly growing problem within the United States. We've all seen the scenes of Jews being beaten up on the streets of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, and of students being shouted down on college campuses or eliminated from being part of their student governments for the quote-unquote crime of being Zionists. We're all aware of the fact that there are many factors that have contributed to this clearly rising tide of anti-Semitism on both extremes of the political spectrum, and are aware that elements of anti-Semitism have been steadily capturing the hearts and minds of many young people on the left and steadily encroaching in Jeremy Corbyn-like, in particular, into certain elements of the Democratic Party. We're here today to examine to what degree CAIR, the Council of American Islamic Relations, ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, the Muslim Students Association, all with known and proven ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, have contributed to this problem. I do feel it's important from the outset to state that the Muslim community in the United States, as well as the Muslim community across the globe, is not one monolithic mass. Many of the most philo-Semitic voices that I'm hearing today are from Muslims or from former Muslims, such as that of our very own Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour, and from Zuhdi Jasser, Noni Jarwish, Rakhil Risa, Ayan Hirsi Ali, and Wafa Sultan. And there are many, many more like those. We can also not lump together the entire 1.5 or 1.6 billion members of the Muslim community, which stretches from the Emirates to the Taliban of Afghanistan, and paint them all over with one wide brush. That's why we are profoundly honored to have with us today one of the world's leading experts on this problem, Steve Emerson. Steve is considered one of the leading authorities on Islamic extremist networks, financing and operations, as well as national security and intelligence. He is the executive director of the Investigative Project on Terrorism, a wonderful nonprofit organization that maintains one of the world's largest storehouses of archival data and intelligence on Islamic and Middle Eastern terrorist groups. Steve and his staff frequently provide briefings to U.S. government and law enforcement officials, Congress members, and congressional committees. They also produce print and electronic media on terrorist financing, the operational networks of Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and the rest of the worldwide Islamic militant spectrum. Steve launched the Investigative Project on Terrorism in 1995, following the November 1994 broadcast of his documentary film, Jihad in America, which exposed clandestine operations of militant Islamic terrorist groups on American soil. Steve is one of the first terrorism experts to have testified and warned about the threat of Islamic militant networks operating here in the United States and their connections worldwide. In a pioneering congressional testimony delivered in 1998, Steve specifically warned about the threat of Osama bin Laden's network. Nearly every one of the terrorist suspects and groups first identified in his 1994 film have been indicted, convicted, or deported since 9/11. Steve has worked at CNN, U.S. News and World Report, and has freelanced for the New York Times Magazine and the New Republic. He's also the author or co-author of 6 books on terrorism and national security. He has a BA and MA from Brown University and is very proud to say that he once ran a marathon in 2 hours, 59 minutes, a feat that might be hard for him to achieve today. Steve, it is my esteemed honor and pleasure to welcome you back to another Met broadcast. So tell us a little bit about the state of radical Islamic terrorism here in the United States.
Thanks, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be with everybody here today. I hope my sound is okay, and thank you for reading from the press release that's on our website, word for word. But I would say that I echo your point that there's no generalization that ever should be made about any religion, but especially generalizations about Islam just are totally inappropriate and unacceptable, because there's such diversity within Islam and interpretations. So when I talk and others talk about Islamists or political Islam, we're talking about an interpretation or political ideology that really is less religious than it is political, and that political ideology is really stemming from a parental ancestral ideology over the last 100 years or so, 100 years this decade, from Hassan al-Banna. Hassan al-Banna was an Egyptian, he was an Egyptian scholar actually, but activist who basically rebelled against the colonial empire, but in a way that wanted to bring back the fundamentals of Islam, sort of back to the future, sort of in a way of rebelling against the colonial empire by rebelling against Westernism, and especially against world Jewry. Anti-Semitism was a big component of his platform, although it became much more embedded in latter generations of Muslim Brotherhood leaders and organizations. The Muslim Brotherhood itself, it began to develop under Egypt, in Egypt, to the extent that Hassan al-Banna became a threat to Egypt, and he was assassinated. But his disciples continued, and one of them was Sayyid Qutb, who actually wrote a very influential essay in 1950 called "Our Struggle with the Jews." But even before that, a leading Palestinian figure, Haj Amin al-Husseini, actually met with Hitler in 1938-39 in Berlin. And according to a relatively recent academic studies that had not been made available, that his documents hadn't made available until this last 20 years, it was al-Husseini who suggested to Hitler that the Jews be annihilated, be gassed to death, as opposed to Hitler, who actually until 1941 would have been collecting and surrounding Jews and putting them into ghettos, trying to deport them, but no country would deport them, and was contemplating eliminating them, but really didn't come up with the quote final solution until the Swansea conference in January, I think 1942. But it was Haj Amin al-Husseini who suggested it back in 1939. And some scholars believe he was the one that actually initiated, or at least instigated, that idea with Hitler. Having said that, the degree of anti-Semitism, which had been a staple of let's say, Christian anti-Semitism for centuries, suddenly became a staple of Arab anti-Semitism following World War II, in particular because a lot of Nazis moved to Syria, to Cairo in the fight against Israel. That died down within about a generation or so. But in a sense, the level of anti-Semitism continued, particularly among the Islamists. And that developed where, at least in the West, when the Muslim Brotherhood started branching out in the West, in Europe, and in the United States. In the United States is where our story picks up. And so I think we have our first chart. If we can pull that up, we can see where the Muslim Brotherhood started. It actually it began its origins in the U.S. in 1964 at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana with the first MSA, and then it branched out into several other groups. We'll get this right, don't worry. There we go. So you see MSA is the Muslim Student Association, which ultimately started with one chapter and ultimately grew to hundreds, maybe as many as 500. And then it grew into a sort of a real estate mortgage holding company called National Association of Islamic Trusts, which hold it title to many of the mosques that were built in the 70s and 80s. That led in turn to ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America. I will say this about ISNA, as opposed to, let's say, some of the other groups like Muslim American Society, which is the de facto Muslim Brotherhood arm in the United States. I mean, they actually openly have stated that. ISNA has become more moderate in recent years. It's ebbed and flowed, but it's sort of diverged from the path of some of the other groups, even though the speakers at some of the recent conferences still traffic in a lot of the old tropes, but the organization itself really, I think, from my perspective, has definitely diverged from the radical path that the other groups have taken. Some of the groups like Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, which is not up there, but Hamas certainly is. Hamas is a direct descendant, a child, let's say, of the Muslim Brotherhood. Its charter pays homage to the Muslim Brotherhood. Its charter is full of anti-Semitic tropes, and it gave birth in the United States to an organization called the Palestine Committee, which then gave birth to a whole plethora of organizations, including the Islamic Association for Palestine and CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which everyone is familiar with today. That in itself continues today. And CAIR now exists in a atmosphere today in the United States of other Islamist groups. Many more exist today alongside CAIR. One in particular called the American Muslims for Palestine, which was created exactly after or about the same time that the group IAP, the Islamic Association for Palestine, another Hamas created group, very anti-Semitic. It was found guilty of laundering money to Hamas terrorists, went bankrupt in order not to pay the bills, not to pay the award. It led to the creation of American Muslims for Palestine. And as you can see from the video that we'll show, and from the reports we have on our website, is exceptionally and extraordinarily anti-Semitic, even though we suspect a lot of its funds come from foreign sources. And the same charges that they make against American supporters of Israel, claiming that they're dual nationals, I would say that they are basically projecting, because their allegiance is really to a international, either Islamist international or to some other entity. It's definitely not to a pluralistic United States, which I think is the ideal for any U.S. citizen. Having said that, the level of vitriol, of anti-Semitic vitriol from the Muslim Brotherhood created groups in the United States, especially from CAIR, especially from the American Muslims for Palestine, especially from Students for Justice for Palestine, and from dozens of other newly created groups within the last 10 years, has been absolutely extraordinarily unparalleled, and yet has gotten largely unreported by the American media. If you look at the definition of the accepted definition by the United States and most European countries of what anti-Semitism is, denying Jewish people the right of self-determination is a key component. And those groups absolutely, without hesitation, deny the existence of Israel. They refuse to accept it. They deride the existence. Not only deride the existence of Israel, they deride its supporters in the United States, often deriding them as either Zion Nazis or dual loyalists or whatever, in very bigoted terms, even though they issue their own reports accusing others, like myself, of being bigoted. So there you have a sort of a larger picture. Why don't we go to the videotape, which was Ted Koppel's favorite term when he used to run Nightline. And it's a 3-minute, just a collection of some recent tapes from AMP and CAIR. Okay. Technically, we're almost there. Here we go. This is Sarah Ballou from AMP at a recent conference.
Oppose the polite Zionists too. They are not your friends. They will not be there for you when you need them. They will take your friendship and throw your Palestinian brothers and sisters under the bus. Oh, you get along because you're all in Girl Scouts together? Talk to them about what is happening in Palestine and see how that conversation goes. And I'm not going to sugarcoat that. They are your enemies. There are organizations and infrastructures out there who are working to harm you.
If a Muslim shows up to an interfaith space, we need to be willing to compromise on Israel's right to exist for us to be able to participate in the conversation. I'm done with it. If you want to be in community with me, my people, and the Palestinians I work in solidarity with, then let's have a conversation about how Israel as it exists today is an illegitimate state.
That is, as Islam is being hijacked by ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Israel is hijacking Judaism. And I'm not going to shy away from saying this. And I'm not going to be in this business of political correctness. Oh my God, he compared Israel to ISIS. Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Yes, I did compare Israel to ISIS. Because you're using your religion, you're desecrating your religion to abuse human rights and to kill human beings in the name of a God that is innocent and that does not condone what you do in his name.
One of the greatest social ills facing America today is Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry. And if you trace the organizations and the main advocates and activists of Islamophobia in America, you will see that all those organizations are pro-Israeli occupation organizations and activists. You'll see every single last one.
And remember, Hollywood has not been our ally. Hollywood has distorted the facts. Hollywood has shown freedom fighters as terrorists. Hollywood has done the work that Zionists could not done. Our final destination is Palestine. They have been saying next year to Jerusalem. We say next year to all Palestine.
The Jewish state of Israel claims that it's being attacked because it's Jewish. And it claims it has the right to the land of Palestine because it's Jewish. And it justifies its crimes in Gaza because of its Jewishness or defense of the Jewish people. This is exactly what the Islamic State, ISIS, does.
Well, here you've seen just a 2.5-minute collage of some clips we pulled together. The irony, of course, is when you see Daoud Walid make charges about Islamophobia, which I have to say is a term that was coined and utilized in order not to discuss anti-Muslim racism, but rather to conflate Islam with Islamism, so that anybody who is a critic of, let's say, radical Islam or political Islam can be considered a racist because they would be accused of criticizing Islam, when in fact their criticism is of radical Islam or of Islamic terrorism or of Islamism. And that was the purpose of Islamophobia. It's designed to tar the critics and to conflate Islam with Islamism. It has no rationale in terms of its real reality, in terms of its definitional reality of being, quote, equated to anti-Muslim racism. It has an ulterior agenda of being used to as a euphemism to basically tar anybody who is a critic of Islamism or radical Islam. And also, there is a reason, which I should add, why the French government earlier this year, last year, actually issued a decree that banned the official use of the term Islamophobia in documents when discussing anti-Muslim racism, which they do discuss in discrimination reports, but they struck the term Islamophobia for the explicit purpose of two reasons. One, because they acknowledge the reality that it was designed to tar critics of Islam, and two, because it had been so overused by various Islamist groups, used to the point that anybody who criticized a radical Islamist was called a Islamophobe, that it started to instill paranoia in the minds of vulnerable Islam and actually led to them committing acts of terrorism. So the French government decided, we're not going to use that term. We're just going to use the term anti-Muslim racism. And I can tell you other European governments are considering following in the French footsteps as well. Having said that, you can see the statements made here by CAIR, AMT. Daoud Walid, who was a CAIR official, actually issued another statement. We have many statements, but another one was a khutbah or a sermon in which he invokes a statement, a Quranic statement, allegedly saying that the Jews are, are a cursed people. Again, this is the mindset of a Islamist. It's not the mindset of necessarily of a typical Islamic cleric or anything, but it's someone from CAIR, and they try to influence and indoctrinate as many people as possible. Unfortunately, we can't tell how many people they indoctrinate. I mean, my personal belief is they have far less of support than they claim. We know recently, just the other day, they withdrew from a lawsuit they filed against a former staffer because they didn't want to answer interrogatories, one of which was the monies they get from foreign sources. We know from previous years from public information that they have gotten significant amount of money from foreign sources. And that's a sore point with them because they don't want to have to reveal that. So to the point that they accuse, quote, Israel supporters here of being dual loyalists or Zion Nazis or, having a different interest than the interests of the United States. They compare them to ISIS. They're the ones who are getting foreign monies. And we know that they sought money from Gaddafi. We know that they've got money from Turkey. We know that they've got money from Qatar, which is a big funder of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the facts speak for themselves. in the end, the reality is that the statements are out there publicly, and Awad, whose comments you just heard, Nihad Awad, the founder of CAIR, which the FBI openly described in testimony before the HLF, the Holy Land Foundation, as a front group for Hamas, now has many parts of the mainstream media as parroting their statements without even questioning anything. That's the sad state of affairs when you see that. The media used to be independent to a certain extent. I can say that as a former member of the media, or I shouldn't say former, I still consider myself somewhat of a member of the media, but a bit of a recovering one. But I'm sorry to say that many of my colleagues have really failed the test of the integrity levels that provide the fundamentals of journalism, because they don't question anything that CAIR gives out at press conferences. That's for my sermon separately, but I'd like to open up for questions, Sarah and Hussein, because I think I've spoken enough.
Great. Actually, you've never spoken enough, Steve. It's always a tremendous pleasure to hear from you. And I should also say that Steve has been just a valiant warrior on the front for what we like to call the emet, the truth, and for the distinction between what is radical Islamism, and what are the views of the average Muslim. And CAIR unfortunately pretends to speak for every Muslim in the United States. And before I turn this over to Hussein Abubakar Mansour, who is the director of Emet's program on emerging democracies from out of the Middle East, I'd like to direct everyone's attention to an article that Hussein just wrote very recently that is on our website, The War on Muslims' Future. And it is talking about the International Islamophobia Act, or the Combating International Islamophobia Act, and why it is actually dangerous for these reasons. Nobody wants to target Muslims, but we do want to target any kind of criticism of radical Islam. So it is really now my pleasure to hand the podium over to Hussein Abubakar Mansour, who will be answering the questions that have come in. Thank you, Hussein.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, Steve, for such a wonderful presentation about a topic that I believe is very urgent, and we've received a lot of questions from our audience. I'm not sure that we're going to have all the time to go through all of them, but I will do my best. And the first question that I've received, now we are talking about this ecosystem of different Islamist organizations in the United States. Is there any central coordination between all of these organizations?
That's a good question, Hussein. In terms of, well, it depends how you define the ecosystem. I think there are parallel systems set up or that exist. There's definitely some type of coordination, or at least communications between the Islamist groups. But then again, within the Islamist infrastructure, you have separation. Let's say the tree diverges between those that were created under, let's say, Hassan al-Banna, and then those that were created under Sayyid Qutb. So you have Jamaat Islamiyah that created, let's say, ISNA, the Islamic Circle of North America, that's mostly Southeast Asian. And then you have groups like CAIR or ISNA that were created more in the traditional Sunni style. To the extent that there's coordination, yeah, there is the Muslim American Society ISNA conference every year, so there's active coordination there. To the extent that there is a Islamist international in the United States. I don't see that. I do see, however, parallel actions, especially last May during the Gaza war, when the anti-Israeli demonstrations, which devolved many times into absolutely vile anti-Semitic rhetoric and calls to actually annihilate Jews in Arabic, which we had translated. And those were sponsored by a whole rainbow or spectrum of different groups, what we call now intersectionalist, which included, of course, Islamists, but it included secular Palestinian groups, it included leftist progressive groups, it included BLM type groups. So I couldn't say that they all act in coordination, although there probably is some type of coordination. But having worked in the nonprofit world, I can tell you there's always competition for dollars. So I don't know how much coordination there really is. There is one group, however, called USSMCO, which is a group that coordinates among, I think it's like 38 members. Ostensibly, it coordinates among all the Islamist groups, and they meet several times a year at times, although I haven't seen them meet recently.
Thank you. We've received a number of questions on the issue of foreign funding. We know that there are many changes that are happening in the Middle East. You have traditional Arab states that are outlawing the Muslim Brotherhood. CAIR is actually on a terrorist organization list in the United Arab Emirates. So we can safely assume, and hopefully assume, that the funding that used to come traditionally from some of the Gulf states or Saudi Arabia is not coming anymore. Does this mean that there's a compensation with funding that's coming from Qatar and Turkey? And can you speak specifically of the Turkish or the AKP funding for American Islamist organizations?
I could, Hussein, but I have to kill you. No, I'm kidding. You're right that the UAE, which had initially funded, I think, the mortgage for the, I may be wrong, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, for the for the building on New Jersey Avenue for CAIR, but they went through an amazing evolution or revolution, and to the extent that they are they not only recognize Israel, they have totally evolved in terms of, you know, recognizing and celebrating the small Jewish community. They allow churches there. They're totally pluralistic. And they put CAIR, they were the first Arab country to put CAIR on the terrorist list back, I think, in 2017. I'm not exactly sure of the year. A very courageous decision. Actually, it was earlier than that, because there was an attempt by CAIR to appeal through their connections in the Obama administration to try to get that lifted. But the UAE stood firm and they refused to lift it. I give them a lot of credit because there's so much evidence about CAIR being a terrorist front group. The FBI called CAIR on the stand in the 2006-7 HLF case. The headline in the Dallas Morning News, which I should have made into a slide, was FBI, CAIR is a front group for Hamas, period. I mean, that was the testimony of Laura Burns at the trial. So, and then the FBI issued a letter in 2008, I believe, or 2009, we have it on our website, to Congress saying they weren't going to meet with CAIR except on issues relating to civil rights until it was resolved about CAIR's connections to Hamas. So there's plenty on the record here showing that, and the ruling about CAIR's unindicted co-conspirator status in the HLF case went further than just their UCC status. It showed that they participated in a conspiracy with Hamas. So there's plenty to go around to show that there is a warranted terrorist designation against CAIR. That's number one. Now, having said that, the money situation is a good one, because as you remember in Woodward Bernstein's book, "Follow the Money" was the key phrase that everyone remembers. And it's a good phrase for anyone to remember who does investigations. I can't say where all the money that they have been getting has been made up from. I doubt that the AKP party is officially giving the money. I would say that generally speaking, it would come from individual sources, in the same way that previously it came from it did come from some organizations. I think the Union of Good was one of them, but in general, it came from individual Gulf wealthy Gulf sources. And in the same way today, it's coming from members of Turkish the elite, or they don't have to live in Turkey, or Qatari elites. I can't say that that's the limit where it's coming from. Other monies are coming from, believe it or not, from secular left-wing U.S. foundations. I mean, tens of millions of dollars are coming. And the Middle East Forum has done a yeoman's job of documenting all of the tens of millions of dollars that come from these foundations in California, which if the donors actually followed the activities of CAIR, they would realize that they're giving to the equivalent of the KKK, but they don't for whatever reason. So the monies are coming from all over, but the foreign monies, I think, as you point out, are the most interesting and the most compelling, because it reflects foreign interests.
Thank you. So I'm gonna actually use some of the questions that I received and ask you a question probably that in the mind of many right now after your answer. Okay, so we have this organization, CAIR, probably violating federal laws, constantly embroiled in problems with connections with Hamas, anti-Semitism, and yet they are operating. They are considered a Muslim civil rights organization by many, including government agencies. As you said, they do receive money and funding from progressive and leftist funds here in the United States. What can we do about this? How can we effectively fight them and stop such an organization?
Well, first of all, I don't know that one could make the case today that they are necessarily violating the law that necessary of material support for terrorism. That may have been the case earlier on. And again, the material support for terrorism means that they are either, let's say, laundering money for terrorism, or in some way assisting in a material way a terrorist group. Okay. Now, initially, if you remember, in 1993, there was a meeting in Philadelphia at the FBI wiretap of Hamas members, and they met specifically in a secret meeting. They even reversed the spelling of the name Hamas to say Sama, because they felt if somebody was listening, they would fool them, but the PI was not very fooled. And they discussed, Nihad Awad was there among more than 24 other members of Hamas, and they discussed creating a new group to do public relations for Hamas in the United States. And that was CAIR, that was created the following year. And again, CAIR was an unindicted member of the HLF in the HLF trial. Having said that, I don't know, I should say that I'm not privy to anything that would suggest that they are violating the the 1995 counterterrorism laws, or the material support laws. But having other laws, I cannot speak to right now. In terms of disclosure of foreign monies or anything else, again, I can't speak to that right now. But the fact is that in the end, it's the way the KKK was defeated. It wasn't defeated by law as much it was defeated by the sunshine of open disclosure by the media, the way it was rooted out by constant exposure that it couldn't exist anymore. It wasn't considered legitimate. The Council on American Islamic Relations could not exist were it not for the collaboration and tacit support and open support by groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, by the ACLU, Human Rights Watch, by the American media writ large. They give them the support, the legitimacy that is so critical to their survival, without which they would just be a KKK living on the fringes of society, if at all.
Before we move to the next part in asking some questions about the Muslim community in the United States, can we deduce from your answer right now that the progressive movement in the United States is now giving a lot of moral support to American Islamism?
I'm sorry, you have to repeat that question.
Can we understand from what you said that one of the major sources of moral support for American Islamism now comes from the American progressive movement?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt that they, CAIR recognizes that to the point that they changed their social positions. They used to be very anti-gay. They used to be very, they wouldn't have even gay people speak before their conferences. Now, of course, they recognize the pragmatism of being intersectional. So they definitely changed in that regard, very tactical, but their anti-Semitism hasn't changed. Their support and rationality for defending Islamic terrorism against Israel and against certain other countries hasn't changed. Their defense of Islamic terrorists here in the United States, which they can that are all innocent, hasn't changed. Their desire to stop anyone from talking to the FBI hasn't changed. So, but you're 100% right. The cooperation and agreements they have with the Southern Poverty Law Center, for some of us who grew up with Morris Dees as a hero and the Southern Poverty Law Center as a wonderful institution, and to see that great institution descend to the gutter with CAIR, literally an anti-Semitic, anti-American, Hamas-created front group, is sad, but also repugnant to every value that any American would have.
Thank you. It's truly sad and heartbreaking in many ways to see this happening.
Let me add one other thing here. In 2003, Senator Schumer, who is then I think head of a subcommittee, held a hearing in Congress in which CAIR was the subject of, and he himself referred to CAIR as having terrorist ties. And even Senator Durbin from Illinois, who has become CAIR's best friend, one of best friends in Congress, even talked about CAIR's troubling ties to terrorism. And yet today, in the last several years, Senator Schumer has actually signed CAIR's annual, congratulations yearbook. So it shows you how the Democrats have suddenly poured on over 120 to 130 Democrats in Congress now sign congratulations to CAIR annually, as opposed to only maybe a dozen, back in 2005 or 6. It shows you the level of support they now receive from the Democratic Party officially, which again is pretty troubling.
Definitely. All right, we talked about the organizational ecology, we talked about the money, we talked about the support from progressive movements and the relations with the government. Let's talk about we have some questions about the Muslim community in the United States as well. Can you please comment on the role of the networks of mosques in supporting CAIR, MSA, MP, ISNA, ICNA, and all of these organizations and American Islamism, and the way also that those organizations are trying to promote Muslim candidates for different offices all across the country?
Well, I would say that I have to say that I'm not an expert on the activities of all mosques, to be quite blunt. So I'm not going to be the person who could answer the question in great detail. Number two, mosques like synagogues or churches are legally not allowed to be involved in campaigns, just so you understand that. Now, some of them do under the table, but generally speaking, they're not allowed to, in order to retain their status of not having to file a 990 and to keep their nonprofit status. Having said that, I think there's a lot more diversity among American mosques today than there used to be under when Nate controlled most of the mosques, let's say 20 years ago. I think there really has been a lot more ideological diversity and religious diversity in terms of interpretations. So I would not be the right person to ask about, let's say, general patterns here, but other observers of mosques who really see what's going on in their own states. I think there really has been a much more of a willingness by mosques in the last decade to go their own route than I did witness in the first decade after 9/11.
Amazing. Can you speak about the connection between CAIR, if there is at all, and other groups with Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib?
Well, certainly there is a mutual admiration society between the two. And Ilhan Omar and Tlaib have spoken at CAIR events around the country. And there obviously is some type of support generated by CAIR's political arm for legislation, for example, the Islamophobia legislation that Ilhan Omar sponsored. And for comment, anytime Rashida Tlaib makes a outrageous comment, an anti-Semitic comment, or Ilhan Omar does, and she gets blowback, CAIR is the first to come to her defense and attack her attackers. I don't, and as far as fundraising, I don't know of any fundraisers that have been put on behalf of CAIR, certainly not officially as their 501c3, they're not allowed to. As a 501c4, they would be allowed to, I think. I'm not sure, I don't, let me withdraw that. I'm not a specialist on that, so I don't know to that extent. But certainly politically, there's definitely mutual support, some coordination. I can't tell you the extent, but Omar and Tlaib are the two most vocally supportive of CAIR's issues within Congress. So it's natural that each other scratches the other's back.
Thank you. Well, we received actually a request from Steve Gerzoff. He's asking about a reference to the piece of information about the connection of the Mufti with the gas chambers.
Yes, I would say to you that I've read several books. I know there are two authors that have written really very good books. One is by Barry Rubin. I think he wrote the book in 2008. The other one is by Edwin Black. those are in English. And then there was a new book that came out in Germany in the last 3 years, and parts of it have been translated into English. The reason it was in German because these were German archives based on Hitler's documents that were just released by Germany, and some of them were actually in the American archives that were never released. For example, Haj al-Husseini, the U.S. government wanted to indict him for war crimes and hold him and hold him trial at the Nuremberg trials, and it was vetoed by other higher ups in the U.S. government precisely because of his role in the final solution against Jews. Okay, so the role that he played in the final solution, in the genocide of Jews in World War II, in terms of his relationship with Hitler, his support, material support, the divisions he sent to Hitler to operate the gas chambers was so significant that prosecutors in 1945 and 40 wanted to try him and then prepared indictments of him, and he escaped those indictments, went back to Palestine, what he called, to continue his agitation, and he escaped. He actually revealed a little bit in his autobiography, not much, but the real documents were in the American archives and the German archives, and they're very stunning because they really reveal the origins of where Hitler got his ideas for the gas chambers.
Thank you. Several countries have designated the Muslim Brotherhood and their affiliates as terrorist organizations, and there were efforts to get the U.S. Congress to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as well. Why has these efforts stalled, and does CAIR have a hand in stopping this from happening?
I must say that I have been on both sides of that issue. I'll be quite honest, because it's not very easy for legal reasons to just designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist group. You can imagine there are different branches, there are different iterations. Not every different branch, every group is equivalent to the other group. And to just broadly designate, it's the same problem that happened right after 9/11 when the government tried to freeze the assets of various Islamist charities. For example, Al-Haramain or others, they had worldwide chapters, but they could only go after, let's say, 1 or 2 chapters in the US. They couldn't go after the worldwide chapters, even though they knew the organization itself stank from the head up, okay, or the head down. So the bottom line here is to designate the MB. Frankly, the scholars we spoke to said that if you just designate the Muslim Brotherhood automatically, it would be challenged in court and probably be unconstitutional in any Supreme Court or even appeals court, because it's a broad generalization that could never be applicably apply that actually to all organizations. How would you apply it? Who would be the one who determined which one was an MB, and would it be worldwide? So in order to really apply that law, you have to really get into the specifics of which organization and provide the evidence for it. It's the same way that when the US government froze the assets of more than a dozen charitable front groups or terrorists, they needed evidence for it. They couldn't just say, we're going to freeze the assets and that's it because we believe them to be it. They had to provide the evidence, and it had to be open source evidence. I know that for a fact. And so that's in the same rationale, and legally, that's the same reason why the MB can be called a terrorist group, but in terms of designating it with the legal implications, they would then have the right to appeal, or at least branches of, and say, look, you're putting us under this general umbrella. Where's the proof that we ourselves are funneling money to terrorism? So I think the law itself, the way it's been proposed, is too general. It has to be much more specific and provide the rationale for which groups are to be designated, as opposed to the big general name MB.
Thank you. We received multiple of questions, actually, as you may imagine, inquiring about the Islamophobia Act that was introduced recently by Ilhan Omar. Can you please comment on the Islamophobia Act and its possible repercussions in terms of giving immunity to Islamism?
I'm not sure about, I don't believe that it provides like generalized immunity for anything. There are certain provisions. It basically, the act, the provisions that I'm more familiar with are what constitutes violations of the law or what constitutes Islamophobia, and therefore would require government intervention or to be called be listed as a hate crime if you violate the law, or to be charged with violating the law. So under those conditions, under those provisions, the Islamophobia Act, if you criticized under Ilhan Omar, you could be considered violating the Islamophobia Act. It's so loosely worded, and the term itself is so loaded with deliberately to include anybody who, again, who criticizes radical Islam, that any critic, even if the U.S. government itself criticized radical Islam, as opposed to, let's say, criticize the KKK, they're not going to. The U.S. government's not going to get arrested, or any U.S. government official is not going to get penalized for criticizing the KKK. But the Islamophobia Act, to the extent that it's upheld by the courts, that could eventually result in some type of punitive action against a government official or a U.S. private citizen for just making a derogatory comment or criticism of a radical Islamist who makes a racist statement about Jews, Christians, or some other religion. It's flipping reality on its head. It's Orwellian, and that's why it's so dangerous.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. And I want to thank all of our audience who sent us all your questions. And I apologize for all those who sent questions we didn't get the time to ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our incredible audience. We've had an outstanding number of people that have tuned in for today's webinar for our very, very outstanding speaker, Steve Emerson. I would like to direct everybody to Steve's website at www.Investigative on Terrorism. I'd like to ask you all to support his work. It's, yeoman's work that he's been doing for decades and decades and decades. Mm-hmm. Also, we really do need the support to continue to provide these webinars. AMEP believes very strongly that an educated public does eventually trickle up to educated politicians and lawmakers, and that is part of our responsibility as well. We're on the phone every single day talking to staffers or members of Congress or of the U.S. Senate. So if you'd like to support our work, please go to www.ametonline.org. And one day I would actually like to have Hussein back, who has uncovered another spokesperson for anti-Semitism within the Arab and Muslim community very, very early on, an Iraqi Hussein Yunus, I think his name was, am I mistaken, Hussein, who had actually been one of the architects actually also of promulgating anti-Semitism within the Muslim and Arab world, which is really unfortunate. And many of us know about Hussein, but very, very few people know about this individual. And I think it's important that the word gets out just to straighten the historic record. Hussein, do you want to just talk a minute about this person before we sign off?
Sure. It's a person that I don't believe that a lot of English sources do mention. His name was Yunus Bahari. He was an Iraqi journalist, and then he lived in Germany throughout the 30s and the 40s. And during his time, he actually became the voice of Berlin, which was a broadcast, radio shortwave broadcast in Arabic that Haj Amin al-Husseini was managing for the Arabic-speaking world, and he was the anchor that broadcasted and translated all of the Nazi materials, and he became a celebrity all across the Arab world. Unfortunately, for some reason, he's completely missed from a lot of historical sources, but he helped directly in indoctrinating truly a whole generation during that period into Nazi beliefs as a form of anti-colonialism and liberation. And he also established a lot of radio practices that became the mainstay of Arab radio, on which Sawt al-Arab, or the voice of the Arabs, from Nasser's Cairo, became built later on. So he seems to be a very influential character that for some reason kind of fell through the cracks of historical inquiry. But at one time, as you said, we should have an event explaining more about this.
But in the meantime, I cannot thank Steve Emerson enough for his years and years of experience, hard-earned experience and wisdom and knowledge. And please support the Investigative Project on Terrorism to help sustain this very, very important and wonderful work. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye now.